Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our recording of Exploring A Course in Miracles podcast. I'm Emily Bennington here with Robert Perry, and today is a truly exciting day for all of us at the Circle, and an exciting day, we believe, for the course more broadly, because today we are not only going to talk about a new section that has been added to the Complete and Annotated Edition of A Course in Miracles and what it says, but we are also going to talk about a really remarkable discovery that you made, Robert, that connects the new material to a journal that course co-scribe Bill Thetford kept in August and September of 1966. It is hard to overstate the significance of adding an entirely new section to the course. And it goes without saying that the pages of the course are sacred ground. And so altering them in any way is a decision that was made with a lot of careful consideration and a lot of deep breaths. So just to give you a point of comparison, we do a lot of hand-wringing over here about whether to make even minor revisions to footnotes. And so, as you'd expect, including new material in the text itself was a very, very big deal. We will get to the reasons why we felt that this edition was of the new material was necessary in just a moment, but I want to point out here as we get started, for those of you who may be new to this conversation, the new section is in chapter 12 of the Complete and Annotated Edition of A Course in Miracles, which we call the CE for short. It's chapter 12, section 3, and the new section is called The Journey into Fear. This section is only 4 paragraphs, and we'll include those paragraphs in the show notes for this podcast. But it's also important for you to note, if you have the CE, that all 4 of these paragraphs appear in Cameo Essay 21 in the back of the CE. So for those of you who are new to the complete edition, we have a series of 33 Cameo essays in the back that were written by Robert. They comment on personal guidance that was given to course scribes Helen and Bill Thetford on how to apply the material. So we've just printed a soft cover version of the CE that includes the new section that we are going to discuss today. So if you'd like to order the soft cover for yourself and have this new section in your text, you can find it on Amazon, or you're welcome to visit circleofa.org/softcover, where you'll find purchase links as well as a series of bonus gifts, including the legendary table tents that I have been wanting to give away here since 2017. And it's only since Sarah Knight arrived, our marketing director, that it actually got done. Having those table tents.
And it's only in your mind that they are legendary.
No, they are legendary. Just ask me and Sarah. But seriously, having those table tents is about as big a deal to me as adding the new section.
God.
I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. But just to be clear, you can find the new section in the soft cover, which you can order at circleofa.org/softcover. Or if you have the hardcover version of the CE, again, you can find all the material that we're covering today in Cameo 21. If you don't have a CE at all, then we are going to put the new section in the show notes for this podcast. So you can find it at circleofa.org/podcast when the recording goes live. So regardless of whether you have a CE or not, we have made it very easy for you to access this new material that has been added to the course. So Robert, as I mentioned, adding a new section to the course is a very significant decision. So let's get started here by talking about why you felt it had to be done in the first place.
Yeah, it's a bit of a long story, and it came on very gradually. The teaching in this section was addressed to Helen and Bill and their relationship, and they clearly regarded it as being intended privately for them. It was in Helen's notes, but was not typed into the text, and was instead included in the special messages, which was a collection of personal messages, most of which did not find their way into the course itself.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the special messages just very briefly because I think a lot of course students, even students who have been with the course for years, don't know what these are. So, can you talk a little bit about what the special messages are and their relevance to the course itself?
Yeah, they're a bit of a grab bag. There's about 13,000 words worth of them, and they're mostly messages deemed personal. So there's messages in there that Helen received after the course for various people and situations. Um, there are messages that she received during the course that were on the personal side. One of her, probably I think her longest poem is in there. There's a good deal of chapter 2 in the text in there, which is not a personal message. But then there are also text sections in there. The section True Empathy in chapter 16 is in there. The section I Need Do Nothing, which was originally addressed to Helen and about a situation in her life, it's in there. The Branching of the Road, a very brief, clearly personal message, but with no specific personal identifiers, that's in there. So it's kind of a grab bag, but it's largely material that Helen took down that was deemed to be personal, even though some of it is in the course. And likewise, there's quite a lot in the text that has a personal flavor to it, even very personal, that eventually got removed or edited to, either removed or edited so it could stay in.
Yeah, and just again for students who are new, the text is when Helen received the material for the course, she wrote it in her notebooks and then dictated it to Bill, who typed it up. And that first draft that Bill typed up is the text. And so
That was
as
their
Helen,
terminology. Yeah.
right. And as Helen was receiving this material, some of it got funneled into the text, got given to Bill to type up, and some of it that they considered to be personal got put into this other category of special messages. And some of the special messages eventually got put into the original printing of the course, but some didn't. And
Right.
so the material that we're covering today was always included in the special messages. It didn't make it into the course proper. So before we get into what this material actually says, I want to talk to you briefly about this idea that some material was too personal to Helen and Bill to include in the course itself. I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
About why they didn't include things?
About just why about material being considered too personal to Helen and Bill to be included in the course proper. I mean, I know we feel that there's so much material that is specific to them, but it's also in the course as general teaching and it's meant to be there. So can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, Helen and Bill themselves, and then when Ken Wapnick came on the scene, he was involved in that whole process. They took a lot of what was given to them personally and lightly edited it so it could be included in the course. The course was not, and Jesus made this clear, it was not meant to include material that was specifically addressed to some situation in Helen and Bill's life. It was meant to be generally applicable to the reader. Okay. But they included a lot of material that was really for them, that addressed itself to them, but with some light editing could then read as if addressed to any reader. And so, for instance, I just mentioned I Need Do Nothing. That was originally placed in the special messages, although it was given a page number for the text, which is kind of odd. And then that went into the course itself. The section, the beginning of the holy relationship in chapter 17, in fact, all of the holy relationship discussions in chapter 17 through 22, they're talking about Helen and Bill's relationship, and they say things that are specific to that relationship and don't apply to just any old relationship or any old holy relationship. And yet they're in there.
There's
And so there
references,
was,
by the way, to that better way moment, the infamous better way moment when Helen and Bill came together, and that inspired the course to come through. Those references, that moment was very specific to Helen and Bill, and yet it's mentioned in the course and always has been there.
right. It's always been there. And in the FIP edition, I counted, I think, 118 references to it. That's a lot of references, 118. So the course, there is no neat dividing line between what was for them and what was to go in the course. And they had no neat dividing line. So they would sometimes take material that addressed situations in their lives, especially their relationship, and edit it lightly and put it in the course. And sometimes they wouldn't.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of course teachers, even very, very prominent course teachers who draw a very clear line that say anything that was directed to Helen and Bill personally doesn't belong in the course. And I'm like, well, do you like the truly helpful prayer? And
Right.
it's like, yeah, this beloved truly helpful prayer. Well, that was a message that was given specifically to help Bill in a situation in his life. And so you're right, it's very muddy, but so much of the really beloved sections of the course, like I Need Do Nothing and Truly Helpful Prayer, and there's countless others that we could name, were directed at Helen and Bill, and yet they've always been there. And so there is no
Yeah.
neat dividing line.
There, it just doesn't exist.
Yeah, but along that line, when you were, I mentioned in the back of the CE, there are 33 cameo essays that you wrote in pulling material that did feel genuinely too personal to Helen and Bill to include in the course proper. So what was that dividing line for you between what was a cameo and what needed to be included in the course proper?
Yeah, well, so the cameos, they're based on material that was just too, we deemed too personal for the course itself. And my role as a writer was just to showcase that material, to draw out the meaning of it, help people understand a bit of the context and so on. But the show, the centerpiece of each cameo is material that Helen received from Jesus. And the the basic dividing line was really, is there enough general teaching applicable to everyone here? And can we easily remove specific references to Helen and Bill, situations in their lives, etc., so that this becomes helpful teaching for the reader? And there were times when we could easily do that. There were times when it required removing quite a lot. Like, for instance, in the section, The Question of Karma in chapter 5, that's great teaching. It's so important, I think. But we had to remove quite a lot from that to make it generally applicable to any reader and not just to Helen and Bill. So that was the idea. If it really just addressed situations in their lives and didn't have a lot of general teaching, like for instance, cameo 14 on the chain of miscreation, it just goes through situation after situation Helen and Bill were in over the course of their afternoon and evening. And there's not a lot of general teaching in there. So it just couldn't be made into a section in the text.
Yeah, and question of karma has always been interesting to me because that's something that wasn't even in Helen's notes. It was in Absence from Felicity, Ken Wapnick's book. And
It was in her notes,
was it?
but it was stuck loose leaf in one of her notebooks. And when those notebooks were copied for the Library of Congress, it wasn't copied.
Wow. Okay, so
we don't have a copy. We just have Ken Wapnick's transcription.
we digress though.
Yeah.
What was it specifically about the material that's now included in chapter 12 that changed your mind? Like, why did you feel like the material, the 4 paragraphs in the
Right.
section needed to be included?
Yeah. Well, there were 4 4 reasons. And the first 2 are, I think, the main ones. First of all, the following section, which is called Looking at the Cause of Fear, when I was writing commentary on that, I noticed, like, okay, so if we're looking at the cause of fear, what are we looking at? And I noticed that it was very difficult to figure out from the section what the cause of fear was, what it was we're looking at. And what I realized was that what we're looking at is made abundantly clear in the material that directly precedes looking at the cause of fear, which is this discourse that we have now included. Okay, there it's very clear that the cause of our fear is our hate, and what we have to look at is our hate. And so that next section is kind of just assuming, like, well, you read that, and now we're going to assume you know what you're supposed to look at, you know what the cause of fear is. And so, that was the beginning of the process.
It's kind of hilarious, actually, that there's a section called Looking at the Cause of Fear, and the reader doesn't know what the cause of fear is. They don't know what they're supposed to be looking at.
Right. Well, we titled it that just because that's so emphatic in the section. Like, there's a line in the section that says, take off the covers and look at what you are afraid of. But then, maybe we should have thought, but wait,
Hey, what are they afraid of?
what are we looking at here? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So that struck me initially in writing commentary shortly after the CE came out in 2017. And then what also really affected me was there is this line in the next chapter, chapter 13, in a section called The Fear of Redemption. And that section begins with this line: you may wonder why it is so crucial that you look upon your hatred and realize its full extent. Now, whenever he refers to something he said before, like overtly refers to it, like remember, or I said this earlier, we tried to put a footnote. And I realized that this is one we missed. When he says, you may wonder why it is so crucial, he obviously is implying I have said that it's so
Right.
crucial, and that's why you're wondering. So it's, you may wonder why it is so crucial that you look upon your hatred and realize its full extent. Now, I did a search, a number of searches just with my, Word document for where he had referred to this. And literally, it did not exist anywhere in the course. There's nowhere where he says how crucial it is to look upon our hatred and realize its full extent. And then I realized, hang on, he's referring back to that quote unquote special message, because, he says it is so crucial to look upon your hatred in chapter 13. In that message, he says, look as calmly as you can upon your hatred. And then he says, and realize its full extent. And in the special message, he says, you do not realize how much you hate your brother. Well, obviously, how much is about the extent of it. So the ideas are there. There's a close similarity in language. He is literally referring to comments made in that special message and to nowhere else in the entire text.
Yeah, so just as a bit of a timeline here, when the complete edition came out in January of 2017, that's about the time that I came on to the scene here at the Circle, and I started working almost immediately on course companions. And then as part of course companions, we had you write commentary for every section in the text and the manual and the
Well,
clarification
I
of
had already
terms. And
started on that, but it became more of a formal thing.
yeah, so anyway, I'm kind of in the weeds here, but what the point is as you were writing the commentary for course companions, that's when it kind of struck you like, oh, something is missing here.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when you discovered what it was missing, we were looking at the cause of fear, you find the cause of fear, it's in a cameo. And so now you're in this uncomfortable position of noting that Jesus is referencing something in a section that doesn't appear in the course itself, but in a cameo. And
which is kind of weird.
that's weird and not right. And
Yeah.
so then that's the thing that got you started thinking, okay, this is a situation that needs to be rectified, right?
Well, no, it just made me think maybe we should do something. So, he acts like the material in the special message, he acts like it's providing the foundation for the following section, looking at the cause of fear. He then refers back to it in the next chapter. It's starting to feel like he's acting like that section was part of the flow of his teaching. And then there were a couple other things that I'll just mention briefly. One is the special message contains 3 explicit references to previous sections. One of them to the very previous section, chapter 12, section 2, other ones to previous chapters. And it's unambiguous. He's basically saying, remember when we said this. And that could be true of a personal message, but it sounds more like this is course teaching. That's why it's referring to other places in the text. And finally, the special message continues themes addressed in the very previous section. So the previous section, which we call Fear is a Call for Love, has this major focus on fear and quote on the quote need to recognize fear and face it without disguise as a crucial step in the undoing of the ego. Well, that whole theme of recognizing what fear really is, facing it without disguise, is picked up in the special message we're talking about, which talks a lot about fear, and basically says you have to look at your hate, which is really the underpinning, the cause of fear. So there's just so many ways in which this section or this special message, whatever we want to call it, acted like it just was part of this seamless flow of text teaching.
Yeah. So the in the material itself, it just feels like there's a hole there if the material is missing. So the text doesn't flow as well. Obviously, as we're saying, when you're looking at the cause of your fear, but you don't have that material that says what the cause of fear is, then that's a
Right.
gaping hole. And so it's
Right.
interesting that Jesus was as the material was coming through, like it almost feels as if it's meant to be there. It always was, right?
Well, that's what we've concluded. And we can't conclude that with absolute certainty. But the fact is, this discourse acts like part of the text. If you look at Helen's notebooks, it's not delineated in any way. It's just part of the flow of teaching. They funneled it off to the special messages, but does that reflect the actual intent? So just as kind of a summary, and we've already basically said this, the special message, it continues themes from the section before it. It lays the foundation for the section after it. It refers to teachings that go before it, and it itself is then referred to in a section that comes after it. So, that just made me feel like it just acts like part of the text. I was still very uncertain. I was asking within and not getting anything really clear. I brought it up within the circle more generally, and there was just a very strong sense that this belonged in there. And I think that's what really made me make my peace with the idea, because
Mm-hmm.
it is a kind of it's a big decision, as you've been saying. And
Huge
I
decision.
think when everybody else said, "What? Of course! I mean, look at this," then I thought, "Yeah, that's right."
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that you certainly don't take lightly because, as I mentioned in the introduction, this is a holy book. This is sacred ground, and so you don't just go adding things to it willy-nilly. But at the same time, I was also thinking, uh-oh, well, we said it was the complete edition, and now we're going to come and say, well, wait, there's something else to be added to the complete edition. Now it's the complete edition.
Yeah, and I think that so much of our guiding principle was not, yes, we can recover exactly what Jesus intended, because we really can't. But our guiding intention has been what serves the reader. And not only does this section act like it's part of the flow of the text, but having it there just unambiguously serves the reader. It fills a hole. It provides important teaching that is not repeated really anywhere else.
Yeah. Yeah, I did. Again, just to reiterate the point that you're making, so many of the footnotes are references back to things that Jesus is referencing back to himself. So when a footnote says, remember that, or when the text says, for example, remember when we talked about this, the footnote will actually reference where that was addressed previously in the
Right,
material. And
right.
so if you run across these kinds of paragraphs that say, remember I said this, and there's a gaping hole there because it's not included, well, then that is a situation that has to be rectified.
Yeah, right. In
Okay.
hindsight, it really feels so clear.
Yeah. So about a month ago, you and I were working on two projects at the same time, and we had the soft cover launch of the CE, which has this new section in it, and we were all really excited and talking about that. And simultaneously, you and I were preparing for a podcast on Bill's journal. And it was only like, it was just a complete accident. It was only in the process of working on both of these things at the same time that you made this really incredible discovery that linked the two things together. So Bill Thetford, as we mentioned in that previous podcast, he kept a journal, short-lived journal, from August to September of 1966. This, as the course was coming through, the course came through from 65 to 72. So Bill was keeping a journal of how he was applying the material. Well, the special message that is the material that was included in the new section is dated September 13th and 14th of 1966. So Bill's journal and the special message are at the same time. And
Mhm.
so you put them together in a really fascinating way. So I was hoping you could walk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, once you're reading Bill's journal, it's kind of obvious. I wish I'd seen it before. So Bill writes, the special message is dated in the special messages September 13th and 14th, like you just said. And Bill has a September 15th entry that says covering September 13th and 14th. So he lays out his entry as talking about the exact 2 days on which that message was received. And here's what he says. Tuesday, which was the 13th, and if you look up calendars from back then, Tuesday, September 13th was a Tuesday, and Wednesday, the 14th, afternoons were spent exclusively on attempts to face and understand fear and hostility. Now, the message, remember, is about fear and hatred, and hostility and hate, obviously, basically the same idea. Helen was in a great panic about this and found everything associated with our collaboration fraught with fear and danger. However, the main change has been the very clear-cut recognition expressed by her to me last night, which would have been the night of the 14th, via phone, that she no longer saw anything fearful about the most recent notes. So now we know what he's been talking about. She's in a panic. They're trying to face fear and hostility. This throws her into a panic until she finally realizes on the night of the 14th that she didn't need to be afraid about the most recent notes. Well, the most recent notes, we know what notes she took down on September 13th and 14th. We know they were about facing fear and hate. He talks about facing fear and hostility.
Which only displays his own discomfort with the word hate, by the way.
Yeah, it does. It
Because he
does.
couldn't even put the word in his journal. He had changed it to a hostility.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. So, and then the message itself anticipates that this process of facing will cause fear. So then Bill continues, it is apparent to both of us that an explicit statement of a problem, namely our ambivalent attitudes toward each other. Now, the message itself talks about their hatred of each other and their love of each other. So obviously, ambivalent attitudes towards each other is a reference to the message. So it's apparent to both of us an explicit statement of a problem or ambivalent attitudes toward each other can only lead to a constructive resolution of this long-standing conflict. So they're realizing this is the way out of the mess they've been in with each other. Helen saw with great clarity last night that the glow of love entirely dispels fear and felt quite radiant when she called. So there's just no doubt whatsoever in terms of the dates, in terms of how what Bill is saying lines up with the content of the message, in terms of the fact that he mentions the most recent notes, and there is no issue about what the most recent notes were. He is talking about that special message. So,
Yes.
and he's
Good.
just one last thing. He's saying that they finally got that facing of their hate really contained the way out for them.
Yeah, and we'll get into the teaching of the new material here in just a few, but I want to make a distinction that feels important here. So some material was personal to Helen and Bill, but was still included in the course. You mentioned the holy relationship chapters, for example. Some material really was too personal and it was removed or placed into special messages or cameo or whatnot. And some material Helen just didn't like. So she was uncomfortable with it and therefore it got removed. And that feels like what's going on here. You know, the special message initially threw Helen into this fearful state because it asked Helen and Bill to look at their fear and their hatred of each other. But then she realized that the message itself came through and had them face that the problem could only be, like, the advice that Jesus is giving can only be constructive. And so because of that, she realized that she didn't have to be afraid of it, but still it was her fear of the message that was coming through that we also have reinforced in Bill's journal that influenced her decision as to whether or not to include that material in the urtext, to pass it on to Bill so it could be included in the course, or to put it in the special message. Like, Helen made that decision, and
Presumably.
we assume.
Yeah.
And this was a pattern, though, of when Helen was uncomfortable with what the content was in certain parts of the course, she would have it removed or take it out or not even put it in the urtext to begin with. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there is definitely a pattern of that. So for instance, Jesus talked in the guidance about buying a winter coat in chapter 1. Jesus makes several references to how threatened she was by that material. It caused her to take down guidance that he said was not right. It distorted her hearing. It caused her to have bad dreams that were unconsciously designed to be a kind of a diversion so that she didn't have to deal with this upsetting teaching. And then, interestingly, that winter coat guidance didn't make it out of her notes. It didn't go anywhere, just stayed in her notes. The sex material, she talked about how upsetting it was for her. The very first discourse after Miracle Principle 18, she mentioned how it's upsetting her, and he tried to reassure her, but that didn't leave her notebooks. Other material on sex, she talked about how uncomfortable she was in the process of taking down the sex material. She says, I didn't know, I hadn't intended on writing a discourse on sex. And Jesus said, correct that to read, I I hadn't intended to do that. No, correct it to read, God knows I hadn't intended to write a discourse on sex. And then he said, answer, he does indeed. And so he's basically saying, yeah, this wasn't your intention to write this. This intention came from God. She still didn't put any of it. She took it all out of the course. So we can see a pattern where she would get uncomfortable with something. In fact, Ken Wapnick, who worked with her on the editing, the final editing process that produced the FIP edition, he said when she was embarrassed or ashamed or afraid, her editing tendencies would go into a kind of a hyperdrive and become this fierce over editing. And so for that reason, he had to remove her poetry from her and remove her autobiography from her, because the more she had it, the more she would just take stuff out. So there is a definite pattern there, no question about it. We don't know what happened in this instance, but it's really tempting to think that even though she recognized that this was their whole way out, she still, had some of that initial fear. That's usually how it works with people. You still have some of that initial feeling.
Yeah.
And that influence things. I think it's a entirely reasonable hypothesis.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm uncomfortable with the sex material and whatnot in the course. The sex material in particular, not because of what it says, but because he just takes all the fun out of it. And then, there's that.
Isn't that because of what it says, though?
Well, good point. But yeah, I guess my distinction there is there's not a teaching that I disagree with related to sex in the course. It's just the teaching itself takes all the fun out of sex.
You want a funner teaching.
I want a more fun teaching. Yeah. And I just think that there are things in the beginning of the course that are uncomfortable. Like he talks about horse racing, gambling addicts, and there's material in there that I wouldn't be comfortable with either, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be there. And there's this widespread belief in the course community that Helen's editing is just sacrosanct, and that if she didn't want it to be in the course, then it shouldn't be there. And I think the pattern that we're pointing to here, where if Helen was uncomfortable with material, it tended to come out. It just shows that there's a very well-intentioned human here, but a human nonetheless. And so as course students, what should be the gauge as to what we consider to be material that should be included in the course? Is it Helen's comfort, or is it what Jesus said, right? So obviously in the CE, we're leaning on the latter.
Yeah, it may have been, it's a reasonable idea that Helen's editing was perfect. It's a reasonable idea that it was very much influenced by her ego. The thing to do is you can't just accept those as articles of faith. You have to go into the editing itself and look at, what happened in the editing, what were the tendencies, the patterns. And from doing that, I think you see the editor was a well-intentioned human who was imperfect, who did things often carelessly and quickly, who made a lot of mistakes in the editing. I think that's just what you find. And that blows away the faith assumption that her editing was perfect. We always like to believe that our scriptures are edited by some kind of divine inspiration. There's a whole history of that. There was this idea, I think, with the something called the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible around the first century. And there was this legend that all 70 of the translators came up with the exact same translation, and that just sounds so great. Oh, I can trust this. I can trust the translation. I can trust the editing. And I think the real story, as we would guess, is much more human.
Well, yeah, even all of our discussion today is further proof of we're all just human. I mean, this whole section not being in the CE when it was originally published,
Yeah,
there's just a human job here, and nobody's claiming to be perfect. we make mistakes. And I think the same thing is true with Helen. I don't necessarily think that it was a mistake per se. I just think we need to watch out for her discomfort being a big part of what pulled material that really should have been included in the course from the beginning.
Well, and that's kind of the whole reason for the CE, because through the various editing processes, she edited as she read her notes to Bill, and then she retyped Bill's urtext and edited as she went. And then she and Bill edited that and produced the Hugh Lynn version. And then she and Ken Wapnick edited that and produced the FIP edition. Every time she touched it, she pulled more and more and more out,
right,
every single time. And so, I just came to believe that she wasn't thinking what's meant to be. She wasn't thinking what's best for the reader. She was thinking with her discomfort.
Right. And it's well known that Helen loved the more poetic language that appears towards the end of the course. And I do too. I agree with her on that, but it still doesn't mean that the material, like the more choppy material at the beginning of the course, shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
Right?
And I
So,
just want to correct what I just said slightly. I think she was often thinking, I'm sure, what does Jesus want here? But I don't think that was the only force involved.
right. Well-intentioned human, but human nonetheless, right?
Yeah.
As we are. So, okay. So Robert, we need to move on to what the actual section says, but can you just give us the punchline of all that we've covered so far?
Well, the punchline is that this discourse, in many specific ways, acts like it's part of the flow of teaching in the text. Yes, it does refer to personal conditions in Helen and Bill's relationship, but many sections do. And finally, we know as a fact that Helen was in a great panic, quote unquote, about this material. And we know that she had a whole pattern of taking things out due to personal discomfort in the form of embarrassment or shame or fear. So there's really, in my mind, there are no genuine obstacles to thinking this belongs there, and all kinds of reasons to think it does.
Okay, so if this material, these precious 4 paragraphs are so important that they should be included in the text proper, let's spend the rest of our time, maybe 10 minutes or so, going over what it is that section actually says.
Well, what I thought we could do is just read some key lines, because all 4 paragraphs would take us a while to go through. So I want to just read some key lines and we can talk about them a bit. Here's how it opens. And this is our edited version. So when it says your brother, it originally said each other. Basically the same thing. Okay, you have no idea of the intensity of your wish to get rid of your brother. This does not mean that you are not strongly impelled toward him, but it does mean that love is not your only emotion. Now, that is some really tough relationship advice.
Yeah, and just so the way that it originally came through is you have no idea of the intensity of your wish to get rid of each other,
right?
Referring to Helen and Bill.
Right.
But again, here's this idea of this is a teaching that applies to all of us. We can all benefit from what he's saying here. And yeah, it is a pretty tough message too, because we do have these love-hate relationships with people, right? Like we're drawn to them. There are all kinds of aspects about them that we love, but there's something about them that we're kind of afraid of too. And so we're constantly leaning in and leaning out.
And he's suggesting we are in denial of just how much we want to get rid of certain people. We have no idea of the intensity of that wish because it's ugly. We don't want to look at it. Okay, so the next paragraph begins, similar note, you do not realize how much you hate your brother. You will not get rid of this until you do realize it. For until then, you will think you want to get rid of him and keep the hatred.
Ouch.
Ouch. Yeah. And I think, yeah, that's another one of those things where it's not the kind of relationship advice you expect to get. You expect to be told, well, if you can just communicate what's inside of you, then they can receive it and it will all work out. He's saying, you've got something inside of you that is truly destructive and bent on destroying the other. And you have to look at that. And what he's saying is, you won't get rid of the hate until you do look at it, because only when you look at it will you think, oh, I don't want to keep this. When you won't look at it, you not knowing it's there, you're fine with keeping it and you think, I want to get rid of him.
I know. I think this is so fascinating, particularly in light of all that we're hearing about cancel culture and whatnot, and the degree to which we just flick people out of our lives left and right these days. I mean, if we're not seeing the problem as our hate, if we're not looking at the cause of fear, if we're not looking at the hate in us and being honest about the fact that it's there, then what we're going to want to do is get rid of the people in our life and think that that's going to get rid of the hate. But what's happening is we're getting rid of the people, but we're keeping the hate.
We're keeping the hate, and we're fine with keeping it because we're not really looking at it. He's counting on a kind of a gross out factor where we look at our hate and we go, oh my God, I don't want something that ugly inside of me. But we're only going to have that reaction when we look.
Which is, and what we tend to do is what Helen did, where Jesus brings up this uncomfortable teaching and we're like, nope, still don't want to do that. And so we pretend like it's not there.
Well, apparently she's going into a panic about being told to look at her hate. So there's such fear around that. And that's part of the teaching here, is that the hate leads to fear. Okay,
but then you kind of pull it out and pretend like it's not there. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Am I getting what you're saying? Do you want to say it again?
No, I was just saying that I can relate, and I'm sure so many of us can relate to having a teaching like you really need to look at your hate. And that brings up something in us that says, I don't have any hate, or I don't want to, or I don't relate to this. And so we either avoid it or we get really panicked and uncomfortable with it, which also causes us to avoid it. And so I think you and I are just saying the same thing.
Okay. Yeah. And I think what's going on with is the choice between getting rid of our brother or getting rid of our hate is, if we aren't looking at our hate as hate, we're thinking this person is objectively awful, right? They're objectively awful. They must go. If we look at our hate, we think, oh my gosh, I have a beast inside of me. It must go. And I think he's really, I think, deeply insightful here to make us realize that's the choice between those two things. Are they objectively awful and must go? Or do I have something objectively awful inside of me and it must go?
Right. Because then you get into these cycles where you're just getting rid of people in your life left and right, but you're stuck with that hate and you're wondering why things don't really change for you.
Yeah, why there are these new crops and then you ditch them too.
And more bodies in the road.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So later in paragraph 2, he says, you do hate and fear him, and your love, which is very real, is totally obscured by it. And it's not that they were not aware of their love for each other. It's that the real nature of that love, which is like a titanic, vast love, that's obscured. They can't be aware of what that love really is while they hold on to the hate. Okay, so paragraph 3, key line here says, look as calmly as you can upon your hatred, recognizing that that's an issue. Like, can you look upon it calmly? For if we are to deny the denial of truth, a reference to the preceding section, we must first recognize what we are denying. So the idea is we have this stuff inside of us that we ultimately want to relinquish, and we'd like to think we can relinquish it without looking at it. But it's almost like, imagine you're in a room full of objects and you have to throw one of them away, but you're blindfolded. It's going to be really hard to throw that away. If you can't see it, it's going to be impossible to throw it away if you can't actually pick it up and hold it in your hand. And so if we're going to deny something within us, and this is a healthy denial he's talking about, this is a relinquishing kind of action. If we're going to deny something, we got to look at it, or we're just shooting an arrow in the dark.
So this to me feels like where the course is at its best, because it's employing the positive use of denial, where you are not denying that something exists, you're just denying its power to affect you. Anything that is not of God doesn't have any real ultimate power to affect you. And so you're seeing the love. I love that line, that phrase you just like, Titanic love. You're seeing the love only, but you're also looking at your hate, and you're appreciating the contrast between these two things. Do you want to say a little more about that?
Well, I'm not sure. I think what he's saying is you're not going to really see the love in its fullness until the hate's gone. But I think until then, he suggests in the first paragraph in material that I didn't read, you're feeling in conflict between the love and the hate. And so I think that's what you're referring to. It's like you feel like you're torn between these two different principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've been involved in a lot of discussions that talk about the course as spiritual bypassing, like it's not really asking us to look at the shadow side of ourselves. It's just asking us to hold up this seemingly uh, unachievable level of forgiveness, like unconditional love, unconditional forgiveness, and that's naive, because it's not asking us to actually look at anything within ourselves in an attempt to change it. And this is just one of many sections in the course where, in fact, he is asking us to
Yeah.
look, and he's asking us to change from the inside out.
And this is the one section where he strongly says you've got to look at your hatred of your brother. He asks us to look at a lot of things in the course, and he asks us to look at the ugliness of our ego. But I would say this is the clearest place where we're supposed to look at hate.
And again, so often in classes, when you and I talk about looking at our hate, it's perceived to be the hatred of ourselves. So you say the course is asking you to look at your hate, and someone will say, I know, I just really don't like myself, and this has been a problem my whole life. I'm just really, really
Who has
down
a
on
hard time
myself.
looking at that?
Yeah.
Who
And
has a hard
so
time with that? We all
here,
are ready to admit that we don't like ourselves. We have self-loathing. We have self-hatred. The hard thing to look at is your hatred of others.
of your brother.
Yeah.
Yeah. The hard thing to look at is our hatred of others. But he's so clearly asking us to do that here. It's amazing how much he can fit into such a tiny bit of copy, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you want
Oh,
to go on?
yeah. So paragraph 4, he says, surely you are willing to look upon what you do not want without fear, even if it frightens you, if you can thereby get rid of it. I think he's trying to kind of thread a needle here where, yes, our hatred does frighten us, but maybe we can muster up the strength to look upon it without fear so we can get rid of it. And the analogy that's always come to my mind about this is imagine you've got a tumor, okay? And there's an x-ray that shows you the tumor. Now the tumor, of course, is going to frighten the normal person, right? But looking at it on the x-ray, if that can, like maybe the doctor says, here, let me show you this to convince you you need the operation. Isn't it possible to think, okay, I'll look because that can lead to me getting rid of this thing, and I'll look without fear. I'll look as calmly as I can. Even if that tumor scares me, maybe I can engage in a looking process that is just as fear-free as possible because I know what that looking process leads to.
You have that example in the cameo 21
Yeah, I know.
in the CE.
I
And
liked
no,
it.
well, I was just about to compliment you on it because I think it's really good, and it's apt here because as we were been saying about fear and looking at our hatred for our brother, it's so uncomfortable that we just want to run from it. We'd rather not know. And who can't relate to that idea with a tumor as well? There are a lot of people out there who would just rather not know if they have a tumor or not. The fear that it arises is too great. And so it just feels safer to not even know that it's there, even if the knowledge could put in place some healthcare that would take it
Right.
out, right?
Right. The unwillingness to look can have grave consequences.
Thank you. Yeah, the unwillingness to look can have grave consequences emotionally and physically. And so it just feels like that's a really good example of what he's talking about here, because there are all kinds of instances where it's just the fear is too great that we just avoid it altogether.
Yeah. So I think that's probably enough passages to read from the section. But I think that just through talking about it now, what I'm coming away with is just that strong message that, you know what? I don't want to look at that stuff in me. I don't want to look at my hate. I want to call it by other names. I want to take in all those messages from out there that say it's always understandable. It's always because of how the world's treated me. It's probably my childhood. It always makes perfect sense. Instead, what we're being told here is no, it's an ugliness in you. And only by looking at it will you decide, you know what, that is so ugly. I just don't want it in me anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a different mindset than A, what we tend to want to believe, and B, what the world's teaching us these days.
The world is teaching us love-hate relationships. We hear that all the time. Like, I have a love-hate relationship with this person. And we just kind of toss that phrase off so casually, and it's accepted casually. But if we really are looking at it as he's asking us to do, then we can get rid of the hate and keep the love. And then our relationships would be healed. And by extension, our world would be a different place. So I
Yeah.
think for me, as I'm thinking about this, the kind of the big takeaway is I don't want to have love-hate relationships anymore. I just would like to keep the love.
Yeah. And it just takes me back to what Bill said in his journal. He and Helen finally got, hang on, this shouldn't be scary. This is the way out.
Yeah. 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 As Martin Luther King famously said, hate is too great a burden to bear.
Mm,
And there's some real truth in that. So
mm.
okay. Well, Robert, my goodness, we are at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and close
Mm.
here unless there's anything else that you want to say. I can't imagine there's anything
No,
that
there
we
isn't.
haven't covered at this point. But I just we've really been through a lot here over this past hour. Why this material is included in the CE now, the importance of it, the relevance of it to all of our lives, and I'm just grateful that it's there. So thank you for all of your work in making this happen.
I'm so glad it's there. It does kind of cause a certain amount of messes for the circle because,
Yeah,
changing of
renumbering the
renumbering, and then what about
reading
the
plans and
commentaries, and but it just had to be there.
yeah. Well, again, the gauge by which we do things isn't what's inconvenient in terms of a numbering structure and a reading plan. It's what does Jesus have to say, and what
Yeah.
do we need to know as course students. So thank you once again, and see you next time. Oh.